It is my enormous honor and privilege to introduce as our keynote speaker the Honorable Jim Webb, Senator of the Commonwealth of Virginia, to begin our program. Senator Webb.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you today. I'd like to begin by thanking Bob Rubin and the Hamilton Project for not only inviting me here, but for having taken on this project as one of their initiatives. Actually, Bob, when you were speaking about the areas that the Hamilton Project has decided to engage in, it's very similar to what we decided to do in our own office when I reached the Senate. I have something that my staff knows well. We call the 80-20 rule, and that is 80% of the time in the Senate you're focusing on the issues that you have to focus on, the committee hearings, the bills that are up, et cetera, but we consciously try to block 20% of our time on what I call the trajectory issues, the long-term issues that are really challenging our country that too often you're not able to focus on in the day-to-day activities of government. Some of that is national security oriented, the need to reorient our national strategy, our national security policy around the country. A lot of it involves economic fairness, how we can work through the vast disparities that have overcome our system in terms of breakdown along what I worry about, class lines, in a way we haven't seen since probably Teddy Roosevelt's administration. But others are these sorts of issues that politicians, I think, too often are afraid of in terms of their own longevity, issues like the one we're talking about today. And so there's something of a confluence here in terms of what we've been trying to do in our office and what the Hamilton Project has been working on. And I also would like to start off by saying very clearly I'm not the expert in this room. I'm someone who has a great deal of concern about the issue of incarceration and all of the implications that have gone into what's happened in our criminal justice system. There are a lot of experts in this room. There will be a panel filled with some very, very dedicated people who've been working on this issue. I would say Professor Bruce Western presented some really fine testimony in one of the hearings we held earlier, and I think we're all very lucky today to have the panel that will follow me to the podium. I came through the military, and I think when you look at the United States Marine Corps, you see a pretty good model on how you can, on the one hand, have a disciplined environment, and on the other hand, have a fair environment. I'm sure that what I've done since then, and when I look at our criminal justice system, has been dramatically affected by what I saw when I was on active duty in the military. But really the seminal event for me in terms of our own system came about when I became, if not the first, one of the first American journalists to be allowed inside the Japanese prison system about 25 years ago. It was an incredible eye-opener, not only in seeing how the prison systems were run, but when I started studying the Japanese criminal justice system writ large as compared to our own even 25 years ago, and was struck by the statistic that in Japan, which had half of our population, there were only 40,000 people in prison, only 40,000 sentenced offenders in prison. At that time, we had 780,000 people in prison in this country. Those of you who are familiar with the system today know that we now have more than 2.3 million people in jail in the United States. One number I saw was 2.38 million people, and approximately 7 million people involved in the criminal justice system one way or the other, either incarcerated or on probation or working on parole under a parole system. That's a staggering statistic, not only in terms of fairness, in terms of how we are approaching the well-being of our society, but in terms of what it does to our economy in two different ways. The cost of incarceration and the cost of lost opportunities for people who enter the prison system and then have a very difficult time for the rest of their lives. And I want to be very clear at the outset, at the same time, that I feel very strongly about the need to put the right people behind bars. We all want to see violent criminals brought to justice. I personally have a very strong feeling about the danger of organized gangs in this country and the fact that we need to enforce the laws in the proper way when it comes to those sorts of activities. But there's something else that's going on when we're locking up such a high percentage of our people and marking so many of them at an early age in a way that affects and in some cases eliminates their chances for the productive sort of life that the rest of us enjoy. And since I've been in the Senate, I've been focusing on these issues as best we can, given the committees that I am on. And as many of you know, we've held a number of hearings. In June of this year, I chaired a joint economic hearing to explore the impact of the illegal drug economy in the United States, addressing the need for policy reforms and trying to develop a line that we could actually measure between where the problem begins, where it hits the street, how it impacts individuals, and what we can do afterwards. In October of last year, I was able to chair a hearing on the larger issue of incarceration, trying to put a price on it, trying to bring experts in to discuss with us the overall price to the United States economy, as I mentioned earlier, in terms, on the one hand, of having to run so many prisons and the criminal justice system writ large, and on the other, the price of lost opportunities. I put together, along with the cooperation of George Mason University, a 3-panel symposium fairly recently that took a broader look at the real range of issues that go into the parameters of illegal drug use in our society, and to try to really discuss solutions that we can put into place in the immediate and also long-term environment. As Mr. Rubin mentioned, I was a co-sponsor of the Second Chance Act, which was passed and signed into law earlier this year. It is a proactive measure. It works to provide job training, drug treatment, and other reentry programs to help ex-offenders stay off the streets and hopefully reduce recidivism rate. I am also a co-sponsor of the Gang Abatement and Prevention Act, which would provide more than $1 billion over 5 years to combat gang violence. And in that regard, I've had a number of personal meetings with law enforcement leaders in this area about the implications of gang violence in Virginia. What do we know from having gone through this experience? We know the United States locks up more people than any other country. We've got 5% of the world's population. We've got 25% of the world's known prison population. We know that we're spending an enormous amount of money. Professor Western estimates the annual correctional spending amount at $70 billion. I would think we're going to get more on that. state spending on corrections increasing 40% over the past 20 years. Professor Glenn Lowry, who testified before my JEC hearing last year, estimated we're spending $200 billion a year on corrections and law enforcement. We know that minority communities are disproportionately represented in the nation's prisons, particularly African Americans, who are 13% of the population and more than half of prison inmates compared to 1/3 20 years ago. We know we're witnessing a very violent war on our border, which is largely driven by the drug trade. There was an article in the Washington Post just yesterday that mentioned that there had been 700 killings along the Mexican border in the last month alone. We know that prisons are housing a great proportion of our nation's mentally ill. The number of mentally ill in prison is calculated nearly 5 times the number of people in inpatient mental hospitals. Forensic psychologist Edith King pointed out that nationwide jails have become the number one holding stop for mentally ill. And we know that we all want to ensure that as many resources as possible are dedicated to something of a triage here. We need to take care in the proper way of violent crime. We need to separate out in some way how we're dealing with drug offenses, and we need to find better ways to treat those who have mental illness. It's not a crime to be mentally ill. It's not a crime to be addicted to drugs. It is a crime to live by violence and to extort money from people who are trying to have a basic way of life. And we need to get back to making those sorts of distinctions, because another thing that I think we have learned that I feel strongly about is we're not locking up the right people. We're locking up the wrong people too often all across our country. The number of people, the statistics that have been shown to me and my staff, the number of people in custody on drug charges increased 13 times in the last 25 years. And despite the number of people we've arrested, the illegal drug industry and the flow of drugs has remained undiminished. The analyses that we've seen in terms of drug use patterns in this country is very interesting when you compare them to who is being imprisoned on drug offenses, on nonviolent drug offenses. The statistics that we have seen on our staff show that drug use really doesn't vary by ethnic group in the United States. It's very, very little variance whatsoever. African Americans are estimated at 14% of regular drug users. They're 37% of those who are arrested for drug offenses, and they're 56% of the people in state prisons on drug crimes. And all of this money and all of this turmoil that has been going into this issue really hasn't affected supply or usage rates. The last study that was done in terms of high school seniors' attitudes about drugs, the 2006 study showed that 86% of high school students in the United States report that it is very easy or fairly easy to obtain marijuana. 47% report the same for cocaine, 39% for crack, 27% for heroin. We've also learned that there's a disconnect in terms of how we are defining gangs. We know that gangs are involved in all sorts of widespread criminal activity, and yet when we talk to people who work in the area of criminal justice, we don't get the discussion about how gangs operate outside of certain communities or across state borders or in many cases internationally, and we have to do a better job about figuring that out. We know that our current combination of enforcement, diversion, interdiction, treatment, and prevention is not working. We need a better formula in terms of how we are dealing with these different areas. We have learned that alternatives to enforcement have shown in a variety of approaches that we can reduce incarceration, we can improve public safety, we can produce social benefits in excess of their costs if we move into more creative ways of dealing with the problems in our society. I would say at this point, after our staff has been working on this for a couple of years in a structural way, we need more analysis. We need more of the type of analysis we're going to get today. We need to hear more from the experts so that we can really examine our options. And we need to work with law enforcement to in some way get our arms around coordinated criminal activity that has crossed state and national borders. And we need to engage America in this entire discussion. Too often we have these discussions either in compartmented ways or they don't happen at all. I recall at the beginning of the presidential campaigns, Arianna Huffington on Huffington Post wrote an article saying that if this didn't become one of the major issues of the presidential campaign, it was a national shame. Well, it didn't become an issue in the presidential campaign at all, and it is a national shame. We need to have this discussion. I believe personally we need to support programs that work for adult offenders that help prevent crime, reintegrate prisoners being released. In this context, there's an enormous need to shift our policy choices to evidence-based options that are proven to contribute to lower crime rates. Fear, political fear, and ideology have too long driven policy in this area. I've been very impressed with what I've seen with respect to drug courts. I think if we can separate drug use from other types of crime and deal with it in a different way, we're going to affect the criminal justice system, and we're going to help improve the lives of people who simply get involved in nonviolent drug use. We've seen a number of assessments in this area. The Center for Court Innovation did a broad review. Their bottom line was that average reduction in recidivism associated with drug courts was 13%. In other words, people who went through drug courts as opposed to going into the regular criminal justice system were 13% less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system after that. The Washington State Institute for Public Policy looked at 57 studies and estimated an 8% decrease. We, in our office, will be looking at ways to examine the further expansion of drug courts. I believe we need to treat drug addiction. We need to separate drug addiction from prison environments to the extent we can. We need to support community and faith-based programs. The last administration put a lot of emphasis on areas in faith-based initiatives that fit with a lot of its own political ideology. I believe that church structures around the country, I can certainly see it in Virginia, are natural repositories that are already in existence where we can encourage reentry programs without having to create new bureaucracies. And I believe that we really need, in a very vigorous way, to take the expertise of the type that we're going to hear today and bring it to the new administration. We got a new set of eyes on the problem and come out with some concrete programs and solutions. And that's why we're here today. And a final point before I take questions, I think, from my experience over the past couple of years, we do have a tremendous opportunity to work on this issue in a bipartisan fashion. When I reach out to colleagues on the other side of the aisle and start discussing this problem. There are people over there who understand the damage that our present way of doing business in the area of criminal justice is putting onto our society. Economically, as this organization is looking at it, in terms of personal harm, in terms of lost opportunities. And so this is a chance for us to commit ourselves to working in this new administration and with this new Congress and with organizations like the Hamilton Project to really start making a difference. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions. I'm going to walk over and get a cup of coffee, and then, yes, sir, I will listen to you while I'm getting my coffee.
Please, there are microphones that we brought to you, and please wait until the microphone gets to you to start your question. And start, please, by saying who you are and what organization you are here with.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, Senator Webb. It's my privilege to see you and speak to you. It seems to me that I'm Walter Jurasek, and I live in Springfield, Virginia, so you're my representative. It seems to me that solution is like a rocket science to solve all the problems and crime. However, my observation is that 25% of high schools are dropouts. They never finish high schools. I went there to the kids and looking around, troubled kids. Their answer was, we don't have the opportunity. The teacher don't teach us anything. The parents don't know what to do. I emphasize that very important is to push for better education, not only for privileged, not only so-called elite, but for all. Without it, we cannot solve the crime problems. Thank you, Senator.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure everyone heard the question. It regarded the importance of education and encouraging young people to finish school. The percentage of high school graduation now, which is, as you said, is about 75%, is about the same as it was when I was young. When people say that the overall percentage has increased, in aggregate terms, it's about the same that it was in the 1960s, 1970s. That doesn't mean we need to that we should accept that it is the norm. If you look at incarceration rates, that the statistics, and if you look at recidivism rates, they're very closely tied to whether someone has finished high school. There's no doubt about that. And another piece of this is something that we have put into one of our initiatives on my staff is adult education, young adult education. I feel very strongly that the best encouragement that you can have, the best encouragement you can have if you're trying to decide whether to stay in school is a parent who can serve as a role model. And there are so many cases where young people get off track. You know, they're 16, they're 17 years old. You might have a child, or you might just rebel and decide you want to go get a job. And then once you haven't finished your education, the on-ramp to get back up on that highway gets harder and harder. And we are exploring an initiative in my office to focus on the young adult, young to a little older adult, to get them a chance to also finish their high school and do something more. So this isn't just a young people problem. It's or challenge. It's a challenge for people who are a little older as well. Are you going to pick, or am I going to?
I can, if you'd like.
Why don't you?
Pick,
we'll be more neutral here.
Right here. Just wait a moment for a microphone. Yes.
Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
Wendell Howe from the Addictions Coalition of Delaware. Also the National Coalition Full Opportunity for Felons Chairman. But let me just say that I think it's great that you've taken leadership in a major way in this country. I'm sad as a criminal justice advocate working at the state level and to see the disproportionate reality of incarceration of primarily young blacks in our criminal justice system, and you've spoken well towards that end. In Delaware, as an example, quickly, we have about 19% population of blacks, yet we have 63% in our prisons. Virginia has the same situation. You have about 19% blacks, and you have 63% or 62% in your prisons. We look at the state of Iowa, we have 2% black population in the state, and 45% of the prison beds are occupied by blacks. There's some real racism that's going on throughout our criminal justice and system, and we have a history of it, and I'm glad that for your participation in the Second Chance Act and your leadership there. One of the things that we've got to do is we've got to break the barriers to create jobs. That's one of the 5 things that people need when they complete reentry. They're basically 5 things. Jobs and housing are 2 of them. I think spiritual support is another, family support is another, and changing the pre-prison attitude of prisoners is another one that's important. What we did in Delaware to break the barriers quickly is that Senator Karen Peterson passed the Senate Bill 226, which allowed us in Delaware to eliminate it allowed us in Delaware for our professional associations or our professional boards to admit felons and others who committed offenses. That has gone a long way. We've created over 200 jobs in our small state in the last couple of years as a result of that declaration. So there's some things that we need from you nationally, and I would hope if the support that we get for funding of these organizations in criminal justice, that you make sure that you limit the amount of funding for staff of new organizations, that you make it go to prisoners programs, and so that we can truly help them.
Right. You raised 2 points that I want to comment on, but I think they're important. One is, I can't tell you how many people have come up to me once I started talking about this issue during the campaign. My political advisors were telling me it was suicide. You know, don't talk about it. I said, how can you not talk about it? You know. But since I started talking about it, I've had so many people come up to me and say, you know, I was convicted of a felony when I was 22 years old. I'm 40 years old now. I've gotten out. I've got an education. I want to work, and I've got this thing following me around the rest of my life. When can I say I have paid the price? And it's very important for us, and particularly with the magnitude of this problem right now, that we create the right attitude as long as the people who are coming out of the system are moving forward in the right direction. We've got to reinforce that. And it's a leadership question, and it's a community question. And the other piece of it, when you look at the disproportionate nature in terms of the results along racial lines, the last book that I wrote, I used an example when I was trying to explain the implications of sort of minor drug use and the way we're not dealing with this honestly. And I said, and I'll say again right now, there's a street corner in Washington, D.C. at this moment where a young black man is selling some drugs to it could even be another black person, but a young black man in that community, is on a street corner selling drugs. You got somebody coming in from Northern Virginia. They could be white, they could be Asian, they could be well-off African American. It doesn't matter. That person's going to buy those drugs, drive back into Springfield, let's say, sell them. Now, once the person who has bought that drugs clears that neighborhood, the chances of them getting caught are pretty small. But because the drug activity is so concentrated in this neighborhood up here where the young black man is selling, sooner or later he's going to get caught. And then somebody else is going to come behind him. He's going to go to jail. He's going to enter a hell in which he will never recover. And so you've got two people basically doing the same thing, quite frankly, by the time they're 50 years old, the person who bought that drug and took it out into Northern Virginia is going to talk about his reckless youth, and it might even be a judge. You know, I mean, I went to Georgetown Law School. I know what this is all about. And then the person who got caught, he's probably not even going to be able to vote. That is the reality. That's the challenge that we have, and that's why we've got to kind of triage what we're putting people in jail for and look for better ways to deal with it.
Take a question from over here. Second person there, yes, please. And please try to ask, when you get the microphone, please try to ask a short, focused question.
Max Kenner from the Bard Prison Initiative at Bard College in New York.
Yes, sir.
We know the scope of the problem. Nearly 2.5 Americans in prison. We also know who's in prison, that prison's target or the people in prison end up being overwhelmingly from certain communities, right? So in those communities, the net is cast so wide, particularly among black men, that we know there are people who are capable there. We know there are people who, are ethical there, the whole thing. Given all that, is it then cynical for us to really emphasize treatment and vocational education rather than a liberal arts education, mathematics, history, the arts, etc., as a means of reintegrating people into the economy and also as a means of healing?
Well, let me talk for a minute about what impressed me about the Japanese model when I was over there as a journalist, because it sort of goes to what I've been saying about triaging the people that we're bringing inside this whole net of criminal justice. We're lumping all these people together. We're putting more and more people in prison for nonviolent crimes. One thing that we've seen in the studies that I should have mentioned when I was talking is that the level of criminal activity really hasn't gone up as the American prison population has increased. It's the enforcement mechanism that has gotten wider for things like probation violations or parole violations or systemic types of things. But we're lumping all these people together, and then they're getting involved in prison environment, and the chance of recidivism is really higher. In Japan, what they do is they have two different types. And obviously, we're not Japan. I'm not saying we should follow the model, but it goes to what you're talking about. They have two types of prisons, Category A, Category B. Category A, first offenders. Whatever your offense is, your first offender, you go into Category A. Category B, career criminals. They separate them out in a different place. But in the Category A prisons, what they did when I was going through the system was they focused on reentry. They basically said, you're all going to work, and we're going to teach you a skill that is marketable. You could learn at that time, you could pick your skill today. At that time, it was very heavily automobile mechanics, workman type skills. And then you got a certificate from that prison. Or from the prison system. It doesn't say the Japanese Ministry of Justice gives you the certificate. It's just the same certificate you would get anywhere else, a marketable certificate. You go back in your community, you have this marketable skill, and you're ready to go. So the idea of creating a skill that someone can take out of prison and bring to the community, I think is a very valid concept.
Okay, another question of woman back there.
Hello, I'm Ann Loper from the University of Virginia, and I echo all the comments appreciating what you've done. Among this increase, one group that I think has particularly been affected is women. The increase among women has been astronomical in the last 20 years. Many of these women who are themselves single-parent mothers with the impact just rippling on and on through those communities. I wonder what thoughts you might have about initiatives or policy issues or things that we might be thinking about in terms of women in prison and how we might be addressing their needs.
You know, honestly, I don't have any specific policy recommendation. I'm happy to, to listen to people's viewpoints. I know that the nature of the nature of incarceration for a lot of women is different because of motherhood, and in some cases being expected mothers and those sorts of things. But I'm happy to listen to people on that. Yes, sir.
Bob?
Senator, my question is this. You, having lived in the world that you're living in now for 6.5 years, you talked about the fear of politicians for dealing with it. You talked about ideology. We have this enormous fragmentation of our criminal justice system across states, cities, and localities. How do you break through all of that politically so that you can actually move forward in some concrete way? And if you did have the opportunity, what are 2 or 3 concrete things you'd like to see happen over the next few years?
The question is about political fear, and I think it invades the political process. Politicians are warned that whatever you say on this issue is going to be cut and spliced, and it's going to be up on a TV ad saying soft on crime, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the counter to that, as with so many other issues, is people in this country really want leadership now, and what they want is people who will stand up and say what's wrong and try to bring issues toward solutions. In terms of initiatives, I think that we will be in a place within the next year or so to come forward with some very specific legislative, I can't say answers, but legislative proposals that will start moving this back in the right direction. Politicians are always asked, where's your legislative fix? This is the kind of issue, as with where the economy is and where our national strategy is going, that it's easy to take one bite or another bite, but what we want is a philosophical approach. And if I had to give you my philosophical approach at the moment, it's first to start what I call the triage. Let's start breaking these components apart. Violent crime, gang crime. We need to have a balance on that issue, as opposed to the way we're dealing with drug situation, which is out of all logical perspective right now, and those who have issues of mental illness and those sorts of things. They're all lumped together, and to push at the early stage right now in making sure that people who come out of prison have the right ability to transition into a meaningful life. Part of that is stigma, as we were talking about before, and part of that is just the reality of getting them skills, having focal points in the communities where they're welcomed back, and those sorts of things.
One last quick question. Gentleman back here. Yes, sir. Microphone is coming this way. No, this here. Yeah.
Thank you. Senator, when I was doing voter protection down in Fredericksburg, there was a woman who was waiting outside the poll booth who said she had accompanied 2 friends but could not vote because she was a convicted felon. And in terms of some of the panoply of things that we're working on to have people reentry, I'd like to know where you think there might be some improvement, Virginia being one of the states that does not permit felons to vote.
If you have paid the price that your community, through its government, has decided you should pay for the crime that you have done, then you should be made whole. I don't think that's a difficult concept. And I know we are one of the few states that requires this intricate process of governmental pardons, et cetera. I've worked with some people that I know personally in other states that have the same problem, and I think it's unfortunate that the pushback on this, when it comes up, is more tinged with, this. You see this in the media, where they'll say, "Oh, we're letting all these bad people come in and they're going to vote in a different way." I think the enormity of the problem in terms of people who have gone through the criminal justice system right now means that we should simply just say, if you have paid the price for the infraction that you made against your community, you're whole. I don't think that's hard. Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Senator Webb.
Thank you.